Theon Greyjoy stood alone on the deck of the Sea Drake, his hair blown by a fierce wind that cut across the Iron Islands like a cold knife. He held the ship's rail with tense fingers, gazing out over the slate-gray waters that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. Beneath that steel sky, his gray eyes wandered far beyond physical sight, to a realm of troubled memories and uncertain futures. He thought of Robb Stark's last words before he had departed for Pike. He remembered the weight of the oath he had never quite sworn but always felt lurking beneath every breath he took among the Starks. He was raised alongside them but was never truly one of them. Still, that uneasy bond lingered in him, refusing to let him follow his father blindly and cast aside everything the Starks had done for him. He recalled the moment Robb had placed trust in him, urging him to sail to the Iron Islands to broker an alliance with Balon Greyjoy, Theon's father. Robb believed that Theon, who had lived with the Starks for so many years, might persuade Balon to stand with the North against the Lannisters. Theon had left Winterfell with a sense of pride, buoyed by the knowledge that his closest friend and king had entrusted him with such a delicate mission. He had sailed across the bight of the sea, dreamt of returning triumphant to Robb, bringing with him the might of the Iron Fleet. At the time, the notion had seemed possible, even straightforward. But what Theon found upon arriving at Pike was no greeting of open arms. Instead, he was met with the cold scorn of a father who dismissed him as weak, a boy kneeling to wolf lords. Balon Greyjoy spoke with bitterness carved into his soul, remnants of old rebellions and humiliations that had cut him deeper than any blade could. Theon could still feel the sting of that rejection, the humiliating moment when Balon had cast aside the letter Robb sent, refusing to even read it. His father's voice had echoed with scorn. "You, who have lived among our foes, dare to stand here and speak of alliances?" Theon had tried to argue, tried to appeal to Balon's sense of pride. The king of the Iron Islands would not be swayed. He meant to strike while the North was weakened, seizing the opportunity to plunder the coastline of the North, perhaps claiming winter-whipped lands that stretched from Torrhen Square to Deepwood Motte. Theon had flinched at the thought. He could not deny that part of his Ironborn blood thrilled at the chance to prove himself a reaver, a conqueror, a fearsome name. Yet something stronger than that call to iron and salt echoed in his mind. The memory of Ned Stark's calm guidance, the unspoken warmth in Robb's eyes whenever they shared laughs or confessions, the loyalty the Starks had shown him despite his uncertain status. He had lain in his old bedchamber that first night, hearing the waves crash against the rocks. Sleep evaded him, as if the sea itself was calling him out to a final reckoning. Dawn came gray and lonely. He rose, having made a choice that would forever alter his destiny. Instead of yielding to his father's scorn and turning his back on the only true family he had ever known, Theon steeled himself. He would not stand idly by while his father launched a war upon the North, upon Robb, upon the men who had been his brothers. It did not matter if doing so would cost him the favor of his father and kin. The thought of betraying Robb was more agonizing than any punishment Balon could inflict. In the days that followed, he moved carefully among the Iron Islands. He listened to the captains and lords of each isle, hearing what they whispered in dark corners of salt-sprayed halls. He found that not all the Ironborn were eager to hurl themselves headlong into another rebellion. There were those who still reeled from their last defeat, who remembered how the might of the Iron Fleet had been reduced to wreckage and blood during Balon Greyjoy's failed uprising. Some older captains saw no profit in a costly war that might only bring ruin again. Others craved the thrill of conquest, the chance to take advantage of a North left battered by southern aggression. Day by day, Theon gleaned small pockets of dissatisfaction with Balon's plan. He found men who believed there might be a better path, a path that could bring wealth and honor without the near-certain doom of a direct assault on northern coasts. He had to be cautious, for it would only take one word of betrayal reaching his father's ears for Theon to be undone, declared a traitor to the Iron Islands or worse. Yara, his sister, was more difficult. She was Balon's chosen heir and commanded the respect of many. She was fierce, cunning, and possessed a confidence Theon often envied. In her eyes, Theon had grown soft, tainted by the ideals of the Greenlands. Winning her over seemed as likely as turning the tide. But he persevered, not letting his sister's skepticism or his father's anger dissuade him. A strange fire burned in his heart, something that felt dangerously like hope. He would not abandon Robb Stark. Yet simply declaring his loyalty to the king in the north would not suffice. He needed more than his personal sword and a few supportive captains. He needed a fleet. He needed men. If he could muster enough Ironborn to challenge Balon's authority, perhaps the Iron Islands could be swayed to Robb's cause, or at least kept from launching an assault against the north. He began with the lesser lords. Lord Harlaw was rumored to be cautious, and his books and learning were whispered of across the Isles. Lord Botley still nursed wounds from the last rebellion. Having lost men and ships, Theon struck quiet alliances, appealed to their wariness, and promised them that the king in the north rewarded loyalty better than the boy king in King's Landing. Robb Stark, Theon argued, was nothing like the Lannisters. He kept his word, valued alliances, and had no lust for trampling the Iron Islands. Indeed, Theon hinted that for the right price, the North might even assist in building new ships or safeguarding trade routes for the Ironborn. It was a careful dance. Some captains refused to listen, proud men who spat at the idea of bending a knee to the Starks. But for every man who dismissed him, another admitted some kernel of interest. Theon found that a surprising number of them disliked the uncertainty of another ill-fated rebellion. The older generation in particular carried memories of defeat. The younger, more restless men wanted a cause that would bring them gold and glory without repeating their fathers' mistakes. To them, Theon told stories of the Lannisters pillaging the Riverlands. He spoke of the devastation ravaging the southern kingdoms, how ripe the spoils might be if they fought on the right side. Days turned to weeks. Theon's secret gatherings grew in both boldness and danger. He risked speaking out in small halls, on quiet beaches under the cover of darkness, on the rocking decks of ships anchored away from Pike's watchful eyes. He drank with men who tested him, who asked him to prove he was truly Ironborn. He answered them with the salt in his veins, reminding them that he had not forgotten the old ways, but had only learned the truth that unbridled pride led to ruin. He hammered home the idea that the North was not their true enemy, that the real threat came from the Lannisters, who would eventually try to bring the Iron Islands to heel once they were done with the Starks and Baratheons. One night, under the fleeting pale light of a waning moon, Theon sat in a dimly lit hall on Great Wyke with a group of captains whose respect he coveted. Their faces were half concealed in shadow, and the tang of ale mingled with the salty air that drifted in through high windows. Theon looked around, heart pounding, and slowly made his case. They listened in heavy silence, their gazes fixed on him. When he finished, silence weighed heavily, pierced only by the crackle of the dying hearth fire. Then one of them, a grim-faced man with a jagged scar across his cheek, rose and placed a calloused hand on Theon's shoulder. Without words, he gripped it firmly and nodded once. Others followed suit with cautious acceptance. Relief washed over Theon like a wave. He had found some measure of loyalty. Securing that loyalty was one thing. Turning it into tangible power was another. Despite his secret alliances, Theon was acutely aware that Balon Greyjoy still ruled with a stern hand, and that Yara's skill and influence surpassed his own. He had to be patient and stealthy in mustering his supporters. Boats were quietly repaired, sails replaced, small retinues of men recruited under pretenses of personal endeavors. Theon tried to cloak his preparations as attempts to prove himself worthy to his father. Balon did not question him deeply at first, too consumed with his own war preparations, but Yara's watchful eye was ever upon him. When the day finally came for Balon to announce his plan in a gathering at Pike, Theon stood at his father's side with forced obedience. The lords and captains had assembled in the massive hall where water dripped down the stone walls and torches sputtered in the drafts. Balon's eyes shone with grim pride as he spoke of striking the north, raiding up the coasts, capturing key strongholds, and sowing terror. Yara wore a wry smile, though she occasionally cast suspicious glances at Theon. It took all of Theon's self-control to remain impassive. Afterward, When Balon demanded Theon prove his loyalty by raiding a vulnerable port town near Seaguard, Theon faced a pivotal decision. In truth, he had been dreading such an order. Defying it openly would unveil his intentions, but following it would mean attacking the north, betraying all that he held dear. So, with trembling resolve, Theon feigned compliance. He prepared a crew loyal to him, men he had subtly chosen over the past weeks. Some had more questionable loyalty, but Theon could only hope that the presence of his unwavering supporters would keep them in check. They sailed under darkness, the Sea Drake leading a small cluster of longships. The plan was to land near the target before dawn. Yet as the coastline of the north appeared on the horizon, Theon's heart thundered. There, in the faint pre-dawn light, he gathered his men on deck. Attention charged the air as they waited for his command. He spoke quietly, addressing those who believed in him. He told them that tonight would begin their true mission, to earn the Iron Islands a place of honor rather than disgrace, to stand with the king in the north instead of raiding his lands. Several men questioned him, uneasy at the idea of defying Balon directly. Theon answered with conviction that had been sparked by loyalty to Robb Stark. He swore that if they succeeded, they would earn wealth and glory beyond what any mere raid could bring them. In that moment, Theon felt the swirl of fate around him. He could not be certain all of his men would follow him. Yet he knew if he turned away from this path, he would be lost forever, a hollow man with no true honor. So he raised his voice above the snapping sails, proclaiming that they would not burn the north that night, but would instead make for White Harbor, the greatest northern port still loyal to the Starks. From there, they would sail north along the coast to seek an audience with Robb Stark himself. A murmur of surprise rose among the crew. Some scowled, furious at the notion. Others lowered their heads, resigned to the path. But enough of them stood by Theon. Enough to overpower dissenters, to maintain control of the ships. Bolstered by the men who had placed their trust in him, Theon set the Sea Drake's prow to the north. The faint glow of sunrise lit their path as they left behind the charade of Balon's ordered raid. It was a dangerous journey. Theon feared that word of his betrayal would spread quickly through the Isles. Balon would inevitably dispatch swift longships to chase him. Yet as days passed and they skirted along the coastline, no obvious pursuit materialized. Perhaps Balon had believed Theon was simply taking an indirect route to raid a softer target. Or perhaps he had found out Theon's plan but had chosen to rally his forces for a larger confrontation later. Regardless, Theon pressed on, urging his rowers to push hard, to reach White Harbor as swiftly as possible. At last they arrived. Theon and his small fleet passed the city's outer defenses under white flags of truce, delivering a message by arrow to the harbor watch. Theon Greyjoy sought parley with the Manderleys on behalf of the king in the north. There was skepticism, as the Manderleys had reason to be wary of Ironborn. But eventually, Theon was escorted to meet Wyman Manderley's son, Wylus, as Lord Wyman himself was temporarily absent. Tension filled the lavish hall that smelled of fish and salt, draped with green and white banners bearing the Merman sigil. Soldiers flanked the entry, eyes stern and swords at the ready. Theon stood with his head high, though his palms were sweaty. He introduced himself not as a conquering Ironborn but as an envoy loyal to Robb Stark. He spoke of forging a new bond, of reversing centuries of enmity. He offered his small fleet of loyal Ironborn to defend the North's coasts from future raids by pirates or rival Ironborn who refused to follow him. It was an audacious claim, but Theon prayed it would be enough to show the Manderleys his sincerity. Wylus Manderley regarded Theon with cautious interest. Despite their suspicion, the Manderleys had reason to consider any friend of Robb's. Messages were dispatched. Over the next several days, Theon waited in uncertain limbo, not knowing if he would be welcomed or thrown into a cell. Eventually, the Raven returned from Robb's war camp. The king in the north summoned Theon to meet him at Moat Cailin, a fortress that commanded the entrance to the north from the swamps of the Neck. So Theon sailed once more, this time escorted by several Manderley ships. The journey was tense but uneventful. When they landed near the broken towers of Moat Cailin, Theon's heart pounded with equal parts dread and relief. He would see Robb again. But how would Robb greet him? With open arms, or with suspicion that he had sold them out once before? Theon disembarked, flanked by a handful of loyal Ironborn captains. Northern soldiers stood watch, their eyes flicking warily to the Kraken sigils. As Theon approached the encampment, he saw the familiar banners of the direwolf, black on a field of white. Memories flooded him of growing up at Winterfell, of following Robb on hunts, of the day Robb was declared king in the north by assembled northern lords. At last, Theon stood before Robb. The young king wore a plain cloak spattered with mud, his auburn hair tucked behind his ears, gray eyes searching. At his side were the Great Jon, Roose Bolton, and other northern lords, each bristling with tension. Theon could see the swirl of suspicion and anger in their stares, but Robb stepped forward first. Theon knelt, pressing a fist to his chest in a gesture that combined both Ironborn and northern forms of respect. He spoke, voice steady, proclaiming that he had returned not as an enemy, but as a man who owed loyalty to Robb Stark above all else. He admitted his father's intentions, revealing that Balon meant to strike at the north. He then offered the ships and men he had managed to sway. He did not flinch when he admitted it might not be enough to stop Balon outright, but they could at least protect key stretches of the coastline, disrupt other Ironborn raiders, and hamper Balon's communication with the Isles. For a long moment, Robb did not respond. The wind rustled the tall grass around Moat Caelin's ruin, and the northern lords seemed ready to draw steel at the slightest provocation. Then, softly, Robb told Theon to rise. He studied Theon's face, searching for deception or cowardice. Theon felt a tremor in his gut but did not shy away from that gaze. Finally, Robb extended a hand. Theon clasped it, heart soaring with relief. Over the next hours, Theon was debriefed by Robb and his counselors. They spoke of the ongoing war with the Lannisters, the precarious position of the North now that King's Landing had consolidated some measure of power under Joffrey. Theon told them of the faction he had assembled among the Ironborn, men who were tired of losing everything to Balon's pride. He explained how they could potentially blockade the Iron Islands, or at least hamper Balon's attempts to launch major raids, if given the right support from the north. Roose Bolton was the first to speak with thinly veiled hostility, suggesting Theon's plan might be a ruse to draw the North's forces away from more critical battlefronts. Theon expected as much. The Great Jon, however, was more inclined to trust Theon. He remembered Theon's presence at Robb's side in earlier battles, the easy camaraderie they'd once shared. Robb, after hearing the arguments, finally decided. They would trust Theon's intentions, but only insofar as Theon's actions continued to prove loyalty. For now, Theon would serve as a liaison between the North and his faction of Ironborn. Thus, Theon found himself not only forgiven but assigned a role of critical importance. With a small retinue of Stark men for protection and oversight, he led his loyal Ironborn up the Salt Spear and around the ragged coasts, making certain that villages under the Stark banner remained protected. They set traps for any Ironborn raiding parties, intercepting them where possible. Theon found no joy in this conflict. He was fighting his own people in a way, but he could not falter. With every skirmish, with every successful defense of a northern fishing hamlet, Theon proved himself to Robb and to his own men. Word traveled quickly across the sea, carried on the lips of merchants and rovers. Theon Greyjoy was no longer the uncertain ward of Ned Stark or the disgraced son of Balon. He was forging a new name, leading the Iron Islands dissenters to fight alongside the North. Tales spread of him saving a small village from a brutal reaver named Harrag the Black, of Theon's archers driving off raiders at the mouth of the Fever River. Some Ironborn spat his name as a curse, calling him a turncloak. Others began to wonder if he might succeed in forging a path to real prosperity, for the king in the north was earning renown as a just leader, and perhaps there was more profit in allying with him than in challenging his might. In these months, Theon learned the intricacies of leadership, far beyond what he had known as a mere squire or companion to Robb. The men under his command were proud and prone to brawls. They adhered to the old way, half expecting Theon to lead them in pillaging runs, or at least to indulge in the spoils of war. Theon balanced his Ironborn swagger with a sense of justice that he had absorbed from the Starks. He allowed some small liberties. After a victory, the men could take certain valuables from the defeated raiders as prizes. But he forbid wanton cruelty, and he demanded they respect the villages under Stark protection. It was a precarious line to walk. Some of his men grumbled that he was more Stark than Greyjoy. Yet others began to admire that Theon's way brought them acceptance in the north. They found themselves welcomed, albeit cautiously, in some towns as protectors instead of raiders. In time, Theon's deeds caught the attention of Yara Greyjoy. She, too, was raiding the north, leading a fearsome fleet that had taken Deepwood Motte after a bloody struggle. She pillaged the surrounding lands, capturing many villages. Word reached Theon through whispered tidings of fear. He burned with shame and rage. Yara's path was one of unbridled brutality, the very horror Theon had sworn to prevent. Still, she was cunning and commanded the loyalty of some of the best Ironborn captains. Theon knew that if Yara chose to confront him directly, his fledgling navy might be outmatched. He warned Robb of the dire threat Yara posed and suggested a plan to retake Deepwood Motte. Robb listened, for the fortress was an important seat in the north, belonging to House Glover. Leaving the site in Yara's hands was a constant thorn in the king in the north side. Robb rallied a force of northern foot, along with cavalry under the command of Roose Bolton. Theon would lead his ships to blockade the coastline near Deepwood Motte. Together, they would trap Yara's forces between the sea and the land. The plan was bold and fraught with risk. Theon stood upon the sea drake's prow at dawn, gazing across the choppy waves. Fog clung to the water's surface like a ghostly veil. Behind him, half a dozen Ironborn longships under his command ready to sail. They were accompanied by northern ships from White Harbor, commanded by Wylus Manderly, who still regarded Theon with an even mix of wariness and respect. Across the land, the battered walls of Deepwood Motte rose from the thick forest. Theon could all but sense Yara's presence within, her men feasting in the great hall or prowling the battlements, confident in their hold. Suddenly, horns blew from inland. The assault had begun. Theon raised a hand, calling his men to row forward. They approached the wooden docks that jutted out from the coast near Deepwood. Northern archers hidden among the trees began loosing arrows at any Ironborn who tried to scramble for longboats. Meanwhile, Theon's blockade formed a curved line at sea, the prows of his ships ready with grappling lines and archers. Any vessel that attempted to flee would be harried. At first, Yara's Ironborn resisted fiercely. From the ramparts, they hurled torches and ballista bolts that fizzled into the cold, damp forest. Theon's own Ironborn, grim-faced at fighting kin, advanced with a mixture of determination and regret, but they pressed on. In the thick of the clash, Theon went ashore with a small strike force, fighting through the courtyard. He wore boiled leather instead of shining plate, moving quickly. He knew that in a direct duel with Yara, he would have to rely on cunning rather than brute force. When at last he reached the great hall, he found it echoing with shouts and clangs of steel. A handful of Yara's men made a stand near the high table. Tables were overturned, scraps of half-eaten food lay strewn about. Flames flickered in wall sconces, casting distorted shadows across the chaos. Theon led the charge, blocking a sword thrust with his shield. He recognized some of the men from Pike, men who had once jeered at him. They spat curses, calling him a traitor. Theon's teeth gritted with the weight of that word, and he responded with his sword, driving them back. Then Yara appeared at the top of the dais, her hair disheveled, her eyes burning. She wielded 2 axes, their blades wickedly sharp. "Turn cloak!" she hissed, voice echoing off the walls. "Do you truly think the wolves will ever embrace you? They will use you and discard you, brother." Theon's chest tightened with mixed emotions. He raised his sword, stepping cautiously forward. "I choose my own fate," he said, voice trembling despite his resolve. "Father's path leads only to ruin. I've seen what loyalty to a lost cause does. Come with me, Yara. Surrender. Let's bring the Ironborn into a new age." She sneered, leveling her axes. "Spare me your empty talk. Your illusions won't last once the wolves grow tired of you." Then she lunged. Their duel was swift and brutal. Yara attacked with the ferocity of the stormy sea, her axes whirling in deadly arcs. Theon moved with desperation, blocking and dodging. Sparks flew each time steel met steel. He stumbled once, nearly losing his footing on a spilled goblet of ale. Yara pressed in, kicking aside a broken chair to get at him. Theon parried one axe blow, but the other clipped his side, drawing blood. He felt a surge of pain, hissed, and responded with a counterslash that grazed Yara's forearm. She snarled, stepping back. A heartbeat passed, a mutual pause. Yara's men around them were falling or surrendering under the combined might of Theon's loyalists and the northern foot. Theon's chest heaved, his breath ragged, blood trickling down his side. Yara panted, her face twisted in rage. "If I have to kill you to stop this madness, I will," she said, her voice quieter now, tinged with something like sorrow. "Though it pains me to see how far you've strayed." Theon steadied himself, brandishing his sword. "We don't have to do this. You know Father's war is doomed. Yield, live, fight for something real." But Yara only snarled once more and attacked. Their steel rang again. Theon felt time slow, adrenaline flooding his senses. He blocked the right-hand axe, then pivoted to avoid the left-hand blow. Yara was stronger than he recalled, or perhaps the fury of betrayal fueled her. He barely managed to twist aside, slashing upward. His blade bit into her shoulder, forcing her to drop her left axe. She cried out, stumbling back. Theon closed in, kicking away her remaining axe as it fell from her injured arm. She glared up at him, unarmed and bleeding, breath ragged. All around them, the hall echoed with dying chaos as the last of her men surrendered or fell. Theon lifted his sword, and for an instant, he imagined plunging it into her chest. But he could not. Instead, he lowered it. "Surrender, sister," he said quietly. She spat blood at his feet. "You truly are lost to the wolves." But she did not move to retrieve a weapon. The fight was over. Theon ordered his men to bind her injuries and take her into custody. As they tended her, Theon felt a hollow ache where joy should have been. He had won, but it had cost him any lingering chance of reconciliation with his family. That victory at Deepwood Motte was hailed among the northern forces. Robb Stark arrived shortly after to witness the aftermath. Though the fortress had suffered damage, it was back in northern hands. Yara Greyjoy was confined in a tower cell, and her men were offered a choice: bend the knee to Robb Stark's rule or face execution. Most, battered and demoralized, chose to live. Robb commended Theon for his bravery, and the Great John led the men in thunderous cheers. Yet Theon could not fully savor it, his mind replaying the look in his sister's eyes. As winter's chill pressed in, Theon and his Ironborn turned their attention to the next step, containing Balon Greyjoy. With Yara defeated, some portion of Balon's fleet had been under her command. Theon still had loyal captains who quietly spread word among the Isles that the tide was turning in favor of the north. Meanwhile, Robb's focus was divided. He needed to deal with the Lannisters in the south, secure alliances with the Riverlords, and keep the Bolton and Karstark factions satisfied. Theon traveled to Torrhen Square for an audience with Robb and several northern lords. The old castle's main hall was sparsely lit by torches. Soldiers stationed at the walls stared warily at the Ironborn who accompanied Theon. Robb had grown thinner, lines of care etching his face. War weighed heavily on the young king. Theon recognized that weight, though it was new to him. They spoke of the final steps needed to end the Iron Islands threat for good. Theon suggested a campaign to sail on Pike itself, to confront Balon and force him to surrender. The northern lords were uncertain. Pike was formidable, perched on its rocky crags, defended by treacherous waters that Ironborn navigated with ease. But Theon insisted that once they landed, many among the Isles would flock to their cause, if only given hope that they could negotiate terms that did not mean the utter destruction of their way of life. A hush followed. Then Robb looked to the gathered men. "There is risk," Robb admitted. "It would mean leaving fewer men to guard the Neck and the western coasts. But if we do nothing, Balon may gather strength again." Theon spoke with a clear voice. "Let me lead the fleet. Under your banner, I will sail to Pike and challenge my father's rule. Most of his ships are scattered or damaged. The ones loyal to me can gain us a foothold. Then your forces can land and reinforce me. Together, we can make Balon bend the knee or remove him from power." Roose Bolton wore his customary half-smile, though his eyes were unreadable. "If Balon refuses, you risk many men. And if he kills you, we lose the impetus for the Ironborn to betray him. This is delicate indeed." Theon swallowed. "I know the cost. I'm willing to take that risk." Robb studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well. We sail in a fortnight. Let us see the might of our combined forces." It took time to assemble the ships and men needed. Theon used every connection he had among the Ironborn to spread rumors of a negotiated settlement that would keep the Isles semi-autonomous under Stark protection. Northern infantry and archers were mustered, ready to sail under the Dire Wolf banner. Wireless Manderley contributed White Harbor warships, while the Ironborn loyal to Theon made ready their smaller, swifter longships. Some among the North voiced doubts, calling this a fool's errand. But Robb and Theon pressed on. Finally, they set sail from White Harbor. The combined fleet was a sight to behold. The proud galleys of House Manderley, replete with green and white sails, flanked by the lean Ironborn longships Theon had recruited, along with a scattering of smaller northern vessels. Theon stood on the Sea Drake's deck, surveying the formation. Never in his life had he imagined leading such a force. For a moment, he felt a pang of gratitude that Robb had trusted him enough to make this possible. Storm clouds gathered overhead as they neared the Iron Islands. The air tasted of salt and omen. Theon guided the fleet toward Pike, mindful of hidden shoals and reefs. He recalled the labyrinth of dangerous waters that had protected Pike for centuries. They approached at dawn, the sky a swirl of turbulent gray, the wind howling across the waves. Pike's towers rose from the rocky crags, connected by swaying rope bridges that looked like twisted spiderwebs in the gloom. Fires lit the fortress's walls, and Theon guessed Balon's watchers had already sounded the alarm. The ring of cliffs surrounding the approach bristled with archers. The surf pounded the sheer rocks below. Here, the Ironborn advantage was greatest. They knew these waters intimately. Theon signaled his captains to maintain a wide approach, hugging the deeper channels. Northern archers returned fire against those on the battlements, while Manderley ships catapulted flaming pots of pitch to keep defenders scrambling. Against all odds, Theon led a small contingent of longships directly into the cove at the base of Pike's fortress. Arrows rained upon them, but the men huddled under shields. Once they found a sliver of beach and jagged rocks, they leapt ashore. Theon was first among them, calling out that any Ironborn who laid down arms would be spared. Only those who insisted on fighting to the death would be shown no quarter. Balon's men on the outer walls resisted fiercely, but Theon's loyalists among the Isles knew secret paths up the cliffs. Under a withering hail of arrows, they scaled narrow goat paths, shocking the defenders who were prepared for an assault from a different angle. Theon watched in grim satisfaction as pockets of Pike's defenders turned on one another. Some had been persuaded by Theon's earlier promises, or recognized the tide turning. This internal strife weakened Balon's immediate defense, allowing the northern infantry to land in force, carrying ladders and siege tools. As the storm peaked, thunder boomed, lightning illuminating the chaos. Theon, soaked to the bone, pressed onward through the gatehouse, sword in hand. He roared for men to follow, and they did, both Ironborn loyalists and northern soldiers who grudgingly acknowledged Theon's leadership here. Once inside, the fortress corridors became a maze of torchlit passages, echoing with screams and clashing steel. Theon fought side by side with a grizzled Manderley knight, driving back a cluster of Balon's guards. Then, in a dim hallway filled with swirling smoke from burning tapestries, he encountered his father. Balon Greyjoy stood in partial plate, his gray hair drenched by the downpour seeping through a collapsed section of the roof. His face twisted with rage at the sight of Theon. Around him stood half a dozen Ironborn, spears leveled. Theon's men halted, uncertain, but Theon stepped forward. "Father," Theon said through the thunderous pounding of his heart, "this can end without more blood. Yield. Accept the king in the North's overlordship, and your people will live." Balon sneered, voice rough as he spat. "You shame me, boy, betraying your own father, your own people. I should have drowned you at birth." He lifted his sword, a battered relic bearing the imprint of the Kraken. "If you want Pike, if you want my crown, then come and take it." Theon's jaw tightened. An eerie sense of finality gripped him. He advanced, ignoring the stabs of pain in his side from old wounds, ignoring the swirl of smoke that singed his lungs. Balon's men surged forward, meeting Theon's loyalists in a savage melee. The corridor erupted in chaos, steel flashing in the torchlight. All around them, men screamed and slipped on blood-slick stone. Theon found himself face to face with Balon Greyjoy, exchanging blows. Balon was older but still strong, fueled by the fury of a wounded kraken. He struck with heavy, deliberate attacks. Theon countered with the speed he had honed in the north. Their blades screeched. Balon managed to batter Theon's sword arm once, the jolt causing Theon to drop his shield. Theon cursed, barely avoiding a killing thrust. One of Theon's captains lunged to assist, but Balon's guard forced him back. Theon realized he would have no easy help in this moment. It was father against son, old versus new. He gritted his teeth, summoning the lessons drilled into him by the master-at-arms at Winterfell. He deflected a thrust, stepping inside Balon's guard, and rammed his pommel into the older man's ribs. Balon staggered, grimacing. "Yield," Theon implored once more, panting. Balon let out a rasping laugh. "Never. We do not so." Then he struck again, a desperate, powerful slash. Theon barely dodged, but the blade bit into his shoulder, drawing blood. He cried out, faltering. Balon pressed the advantage, driving Theon back a step. Smoke burned Theon's eyes. At the edge of his vision, he saw men still locked in brutal struggle. The castle around them shook with thunder. Refusing to retreat, Theon clenched his jaw through the pain. He pivoted, hooking Balon's knee with his own leg in a dangerous move. Balon fell against the wall, momentarily off balance. Theon saw his opening. He drove his sword forward in a fierce thrust. Balon's eyes widened as the blade found its mark, sinking into his chest beneath the breastplate. For a moment, father and son were locked in a tableau of horror, the clang of battle receding into a distant roar. Balon Greyjoy's mouth opened soundlessly. His sword clattered to the stone floor, echoing in the hall. Theon stood trembling, hands still gripping the hilt. Blood seeped around the steel. A flicker of regret or anger crossed Balon's face. Theon would never know which. Slowly, Balon slid from the blade and collapsed on the ground. His breath rattled once, then ceased. Theon fell to his knees, overcome by a wave of shock. Smoke swirled around him, the corridors still churning with chaos. He stared at his father's lifeless form, feeling an odd emptiness. He had never truly received Balon's acceptance, never bridged the gap of years between them. In the end, father and son had stood on opposite sides, each refusing to yield. It was one of Theon's captains who snapped him back to reality. Grabbing Theon's arm, the captain shouted, "We've won, my lord. Pike is ours." When Theon glanced around, he saw Balon's remaining guards throw down their weapons, or lie on the ground in pools of blood. Word spread that Balon Greyjoy was dead. Ironborn who had been on the fence or loyal to Balon now shrank from the fight, unwilling to sacrifice themselves further. As the northern banners were hoisted over Pike's battlements, the fortress belonged to the king in the north. It took hours for the fighting to subside completely. As the storm receded, dawn's pale light revealed the aftermath. Battered walls, smoke drifting from scorched sections of the castle, bodies strewn across courtyards and corridors. Robb Stark arrived with a contingent of his men, stepping gingerly over rubble. He found Theon kneeling near the main hall's threshold, blood staining his side and shoulder. Robb crouched, concern plain in his eyes. "You're hurt?" Robb said. pressing a hand to Theon's arm. Theon shook his head slightly, ignoring the pain. "I killed him," he murmured. "My own father." Robb did not speak immediately. He glanced at the carnage around them, at men hauling away bodies. He squeezed Theon's good shoulder gently. "You did what you had to do," Robb said at last, voice quiet. Theon nodded numbly. His father was gone, and with him the immediate threat to the north. But the cost felt immeasurable. Over the next days, Robb Stark took stock of the Iron Islands. Many Ironborn submitted to his authority, recognizing that, with Balon and Yara defeated, the old rebellion was finished. Some tried to flee or hide, but Theon's loyal captains hunted them down. A few lords declared Theon their rightful ruler, for who else among the Greyjoys remained? Theon was stunned by this notion. He had never seriously considered himself king material. Yet, if he could keep the Iron Islands under the North's broader alliance, perhaps he could prevent more bloodshed. Under Robb's guidance, a formal gathering was convened in the courtyard of Pike. The stands were still scorched, and a chill wind blew in from the sea. The northern lords, including the Great John, Roose Bolton, and Wylis Manderley, gathered in a semicircle around a small dais. The surviving Ironborn lords knelt in front, wearing expressions that ranged from sullen to resigned. Theon stood at Robb's side, his wounds freshly bandaged. Robb's voice carried over the courtyard. "Balon Greyjoy brought war to the north. He took from us, but we have prevailed. Now we offer a chance for peace. Let any who still question our victory speak now, or forever hold their tongues." The crowd was silent, save for the restless shifting of feet on wet stone. Robb turned to Theon, gesturing him forward. Theon stepped onto the dais, feeling every eye upon him. He took a deep breath, the salty wind filling his lungs, and let it out slowly. "I am Theon Greyjoy," he said, voice echoing. "I was raised at Winterfell, a ward of Eddard Stark, who showed me more kindness than my father ever did. In time, I came to love the North as a home. Yet I am also Ironborn. That blood runs through me still. Balon led us astray into a failed rebellion once before. He would have done so again. I could not stand by and watch my father destroy us all in a war we could not win." He paused, gaze sweeping over the assembled lords, both Northern and Ironborn. "I ask you now to set aside the old hatreds. Bend the knee to Robb Stark, the king in the north, as I do. In return, the Iron Islands may retain their customs, their ways, so long as they do not rise in rebellion again. The north does not seek to crush you, only to ensure peace and an end to pointless bloodshed. Follow me, and together we will build a better future for the Ironborn, one where we need not raid and burn to survive. We can stand proud as allies of the north." Silence followed, broken by the crash of distant waves. Then one of the older lords, Lord Harlaw, stepped forward stiffly. He regarded Theon with a long look, then knelt. One by one, the others followed, albeit with varying degrees of willingness. At last, Theon knelt as well, turning to Robb. In a loud voice, he proclaimed, "I offer my fealty to the king in the north. May our peoples find unity in your reign." Robb nodded solemnly, resting a hand on Theon's shoulder. For a fleeting moment, Theon recalled the carefree boyhood they once shared, chasing each other through the courtyards of Winterfell. Now they stood at the cusp of a new era. Theon felt a mixture of gratitude and deep sorrow. His father and sister were gone, and the path ahead would be fraught with mistrust, but at least the dying cycle of rebellion and retribution might be broken. In the weeks that followed, Robb formally named Theon Lord of the Iron Islands, awarding him the authority to rule in Robb's name. It was an unorthodox arrangement, but it maintained stability. Theon oversaw the reconstruction of Pike's damaged sections, ensuring that certain watchtowers and fortifications remained manned by northern soldiers. An uneasy but necessary measure. Merchant ships began to trickle in, hesitant at first but drawn by the possibility of new trade. The Ironborn, for their part, tested Theon's rule in small ways. Yet with Robb's army not far away, and Theon's proven willingness to act decisively, open rebellions were discouraged. There was a moment of quiet reflection when Theon visited the dreary tower cell where Yara was imprisoned, still recovering from her wounds. He approached carefully, nodding to the guards. She lay on a straw pallet, scowling at him through a sheen of feverish sweat. Theon crouched at her side, letting silence settle between them. "They won't kill you," he said at last, voice subdued. "You'll remain a prisoner until we can find a better arrangement. I'm willing to release you if you vow to keep the peace." She spat at the ground. "You think I'll bow to you, little brother? You, who sold your own father's memory?" Pain flickered across Theon's face. He steadied himself. "I did what was necessary to save our people from annihilation. Father gave me no choice." Yara turned her face away, silent. The flicker of hatred and heartbreak in her eyes made Theon's stomach twist. He stood, glancing down at the sister he had once admired so deeply. "Heal," he said quietly, stepping back. "I'll check on you again soon." She did not reply, leaving Theon to depart with a heavy heart. He wondered if she would ever forgive him, or if the gulf between them was now too vast. As spring threatened to break through the lingering cold, the North resumed its focus on the war with the Lannisters. With the Iron Islands at least partially pacified, Robb had freed up enough forces to rally once more to the Riverlands. There, Tywin Lannister's armies pressed the Tullis and Stark-aligned houses. Theon remained behind, overseeing a measure of normalcy returning to the Iron Islands. He sent small contingents of Ironborn ships under loyal captains to assist in patrolling the western coasts, safeguarding supply lines for the north. Letters from Robb spoke of battles won and lost in the Riverlands. The war was far from over, but the North's position was stronger for having removed Balon from the equation. Theon felt a surge of pride whenever he read a message praising the Ironborn who had turned the tide in a skirmish or cut off a raiding party. Perhaps, he thought, in time these old hatreds and grudges might truly fade. Yet the memory of striking down Balon haunted him. Sometimes, in the quiet gloom of Pike Solar, he would stare at the sea, hearing the crash of waves that had drowned countless men. He thought of Ned Stark, who had once told him that honor was not always about following your father's path, but doing what was right, even when it cost you everything. Theon wondered if Ned would have approved of his actions, or if the old lord would have seen too many bodies strewn in their wake. Still, the new Lord Greyjoy carried on, forging alliances with the North, granting a measure of autonomy to each island lord who acknowledged Stark suzerainty. In time, the damage to Pike was repaired. New timbers replaced broken beams, and the fires in the Great Hall's hearth burned bright once more. The tension between Ironborn and Northerners remained, but there were glimmers of a future that might hold some promise. On certain nights, Theon would host feasts, inviting both factions to drink salt ale together, to share stories or at least the courtesy of not drawing steel. These gatherings were uneasy, with suspicious glances and forced smiles, but it was a start. Occasionally, ships from the Iron Islands would return bearing spoils from small-scale raids on Lannister convoys off the coast near Lannisport. The men would present gold and goods to Theon, who in turn sent a share north to Robb. The arrangement benefited both sides, and some of the Ironborn began to see that fighting alongside the North against the Lannisters could be profitable. Theon found himself earning a reluctant respect from those who once called him a turncloak. Word reached Theon that Roose Bolton and others had begun negotiating with Walder Frey for passage across the Twins. Theon wondered if, had he not intervened to rally the Ironborn, the North might have been forced to fight on two fronts. He took a measure of grim satisfaction in knowing he had saved many northern lives. Yet he could not erase the thousands who had already perished or bring back those who had died in the struggles at Deepwood Motte and Pike. Months passed. Robb Stark's campaign in the south continued. Theon corresponded regularly with the king in the north, sending ships to ferry supplies or intercept Lannister forces along the coast. As the alliance solidified, talk spread that Theon might travel to Winterfell to reaffirm his fealty before the northern lords in the seat of House Stark. It would be a symbolic gesture of unity, after all the bloodshed. When Theon at last returned to Winterfell, it was late in the day. The great walls loomed, familiar yet changed by the war's demands. Guards greeted him with stony curiosity, uncertain how to treat the new lord of the Iron Islands. Theon dismounted in the courtyard, inhaling the crisp northern air. Memories flooded him of running through these courtyards as a boy, of sparring in the training yard under Ser Roderick's watchful eye. Inside the hall, banners of the direwolf hung, and the hearth crackled with a welcoming fire. Robb had summoned the remaining northern lords for a brief council. They stood in a half-circle, among them the Great John, Lady Meege Mormont, Lord Serwyn, and others who had survived the ravages of war. When Theon entered, conversation ceased. Some lords looked uneasy, others openly glowered. But then Robb rose from his seat. "Theon Greyjoy," Robb announced, voice strong. "We welcome you back to Winterfell. You are a friend who has proven his loyalty with deeds, not just words." A hush fell. Theon stepped forward, swallowing the lump in his throat. He knelt before Robb, bowing his head. "I, Theon of House Greyjoy, Lord of the Iron Islands, reaffirm my fealty to you, Robb Stark, King in the North. I vow to stand with you against all enemies, to safeguard your coasts and your ships, in return for your protection of my people and our way of life." Robb nodded, placing a hand on Theon's shoulder. "Rise, Lord Greyjoy. Let no one doubt your commitment. From this day, let the Iron Islands and the North be as brothers in arms." Scattered applause rose. The Great John let out a hearty laugh, while Lady Mormont regarded Theon with her hawkish gaze. Nonetheless, acceptance settled over the room, a fragile but genuine unity forged in the fires of war. As evening fell and feasting began, Theon found himself seated near Robb at the high table. They shared cups of strong northern ale, reminiscent of the old days. The tension of the entire hall eased gradually as men and women turned their attention to roast venison, bread, and mead. Theon felt warmth spread through his limbs, from the ale or perhaps from the simple comfort of camaraderie. He glanced at Robb, noticing the lines of worry that had deepened around the young king's eyes. Yet there was also a spark of determination. "You've changed, Theon," Robb said quietly, leaning closer so the conversation remained private. "I remember a boy who laughed at everything, who boasted of conquering the world with a single longship. Now I see a man who carries burdens and responsibilities. Sometimes I hardly recognize you." Theon managed a small, sad smile. "War changes us all. I never wanted some of the choices I had to make, but I couldn't stand by and let the North be destroyed. You were my brother before we knew anything of crowns. That's worth more to me than the approval of a father who never understood me." Robb lifted his goblet, meeting Theon's gaze. To the old days and to the new, they drank, a moment of shared friendship that transcended the bloody divides of the past. In the days that followed, Theon remained at Winterfell, assisting Robb in coordinating plans to relieve certain riverland strongholds. He walked the old castle corridors, greeted old friends among the staff, felt the ghosts of his boyhood at every turn. Despite the familiarity, he sensed that things could never entirely return to the way they were. He was no longer a ward, but a lord in his own right. He belonged neither wholly to the Iron Islands nor to the North. Yet perhaps that in-between place was exactly where he could do the most good. Eventually, Theon returned to Pike, for there was much to do in stabilizing the Isles. He oversaw the partial dismantling of some old Iron Fleet ships to be repurposed for trade, ensuring they would not be used for raids. The rebellious captains who refused to accept his rule were exiled or imprisoned. Word spread across the seas that the Iron Islands had new leadership, forging an unprecedented peace with the North. Some laughed at the idea. Others looked to profit from it. Slowly, commerce began to flow. Winter crept across the land, and the war against the Lannisters raged on. Theon's forces cooperated with the North, raiding Lannister supply lines at sea. Each victory was a small step toward the dream of a united front strong enough to bring the Lannisters to heel. Occasionally, Theon would receive ravens detailing the triumphs and tragedies of Robb's campaign. Men he had known were dying in faraway fields, and the crown weighed ever heavier on Robb's head. Yet they continued persevering. In the Iron Islands, Theon held court in Pike's Great Hall, hearing grievances from lords and captains. He mediated disputes over fishing grounds and safe anchorages, doled out justice for old feuds, and tried to steer his people toward a future of stability. He introduced the concept of negotiated tributes with certain coastal towns in the north, payments in exchange for the Ironborn's sworn protection. Some sneered that it was a coward's extortion, not a reaver's conquest. But Theon saw a chance for a better, less bloody arrangement. In time, coin began to fill the coffers of Pike, fueling the reconstruction of harbors and eventually the building of new longships that could handle deeper oceanic trade routes. There were setbacks. A handful of exiled captains staged pirate raids under false banners, attempting to provoke war anew. Theon sent swift retribution, capturing or sinking their ships. He made an example of the ringleader, hanging him from a sea tower with a sign reading "Betrayer of King and Isles." It was a harsh measure, but it sent a clear message that Theon's rule would not be trifled with. Correspondence from the north indicated that Robb was facing mounting pressure from the Freys and other nominal allies who were growing restless. Theon could do little but assure Robb that the Iron Islands stood ready to support him. In private, Theon wondered if the north would soon be fractured by internal strife. The cost of war was draining every region, and alliances were fickle. Yet, for all these troubles, the alliance between Pike and the north stood firm. Each time Lannister galleys ventured north, Ironborn and Manderly ships harried them, driving them back. On certain raids in the western seas, Theon personally led the assault, capturing valuable cargoes of food and weapons. These were sent north to support Robb's armies. The pride Theon felt in aiding the Starks was a strange transformation of that old yearning for acknowledgement. He realized he no longer needed approval simply to stroke his ego. He wanted to be worthy of the trust Robb had placed in him. Seasons turned. The war with the Lannisters reached a crescendo in the Riverlands. Even from Pike, Theon heard tales of pitched battles near Harrenhal, of cunning maneuvers by Tywin Lannister, and of the tragedies that befell the Tullus. Yet Robb Stark, the young wolf, remained undefeated in open battle, forging a legend that echoed across the Seven Kingdoms. Theon took a dark pride in having played some role, however peripheral, in that success by denying the Lannisters an Ironborn alliance, or worse, a two-front war for the north. When at last a new raven arrived from Robb, bearing news that a grand council would be held at Riverrun, Theon prepared once more to journey inland. He boarded the Sea Drake with a retinue of Ironborn guards, their sails set for White Harbor, and from there the Kings rode south. This time, his departure stirred little protest. The Ironborn had come to accept that Theon's presence in the north was often necessary. They might not love it, but they understood it preserved their new, fragile prosperity. Traveling the King's Road, Theon witnessed firsthand the devastation left by war. Burned farms, ravaged villages, refugees huddled in makeshift camps. Where once he might have seen easy targets for plunder, now he saw tragedy and hardship. His men, once reavers, now offered spare provisions or helped cart the wounded. It felt surreal to Theon, a testament to how far they had come. At Riverrun, Theon joined a gathering of northern and river lords. Robb was there, wearing the weight of a commander who had seen too much carnage. Edmure Tully paced anxiously, worry etched into every line of his face. Lords like Roose Bolton and the Blackfish stood near maps, discussing the final push to break the Lannisters. Theon offered what intelligence he had from the seas, detailing scattered attempts by the Lannisters to reinforce their western holdings. He promised that the Iron Islands would maintain the blockade. During one evening's conference, Theon lingered in a corner of the war room, scanning the lines drawn on parchment. It showed the various territories contested, with colored tokens representing armies. Roose Bolton, eyes cold, approached quietly and spoke with a voice like a blade drawn across ice. "My Lord Greyjoy," Roose said, "the North owes you a debt for your assistance, yet I wonder if the cost to you has been heavier than you anticipated." Theon frowned, meeting the man's gaze. "What do you mean?" Bolton's lip curled in a minimal smile. "You rule a people who despise kneeling, who have always built their legends on the strength of their reavings. Now they bend to you and through you to a king they once called an enemy. Do you fear they will one day rise against you?" Theon breathed in, controlling his temper. Perhaps they will. But my father's path brought us to our knees in another sense, with death and ruin. I believe in a future where the Ironborn can prosper without constant warfare. If they challenge me, I'll answer. Until then, I'll rule as best I can. Roose inclined his head, a mocking sort of respect flickering in his pale eyes. As you say, my lord. War is seldom so tidy, though. He turned and walked away, leaving Theon unsettled. That night, as he lay in a guest chamber at Riverrun, Theon found sleep elusive. He stared at the flickering shadows cast by a single candle. He recalled Yara's sneer, Balon's final scowl, the pity in Robb's eyes when Theon knelt at Winterfell. He wondered if the peace he had forged was too fragile to last. War had a habit of devouring all good intentions, but he vowed not to waver. If the North prevailed in the war against the Lannisters, perhaps the realm could enter a new era, one where old grudges might finally be set aside. Dawn came with a pale light, glimmering on the red walls of Riverrun's castle. The Great John was already bellowing about the next campaign, swearing they would storm Casterly Rock if they had to. Robb was more cautious, wanting to weigh the costs. Theon simply offered the continued commitment of his ships. Soon enough, the War Council concluded, with Robb deciding to move his army west to put pressure on Lannister-held territories. Before Theon departed, he shared one last meal with Robb. They dined in the Solar, a simple affair of bread, fish stew, and ale. The conversation drifted to old memories, the pranks they played in Winterfell, the hunts, the lessons from Lord Eddard. For a moment, their burdens seemed lighter, replaced by the fleeting laughter of youth. When the time came to part ways, Robb gripped Theon's forearm. "I'll not forget what you've done for me, for the North," Robb said, sincerity evident in his eyes. "No matter how this war ends, know that you are my brother." A lump formed in Theon's throat. "And you mine. I'll keep your coast safe and bleed the Lannisters at sea. Let them see what the Kraken can do when allied with the wolf." They clasped arms, an unspoken bond renewing between them, and then parted. Theon rode north, then sailed west, returning to Pike. Months dragged on. Battles were fought and won, lost and drawn. Theon heard rumors of shifting alliances, betrayals, and the complexity of the war escalated. Through it all, he kept the Iron Islands steady, an unlikely anchor in a storm of chaos. And so Theon Greyjoy continued to live in the balance between two worlds, the salt-stained halls of Pike and the winter-bitten keeps of the North. He fought not only for himself, but for the ideals he had come to cherish: loyalty, honor, and a hope for better days. In the end, he had redeemed himself long before his darkest deeds could ever take root. Whether the realm remembered him as a hero or a turncloak, Theon was content to know that, in this life, he had chosen the path of true belonging, the path that led him, at last, to stand proudly beside Robb Stark. There would be other trials ahead. More wars, more crowns, more storms. But Theon, having rallied the Ironborn to the cause of the North, had carved out a place where both bloodlines might find unity. He had made himself whole in a way he never thought possible. Long after the ravens flew to every corner of Westeros with tidings of battles and alliances, there remained a simple truth. Theon Greyjoy, once torn between father and friend, had chosen the bond that had always felt more like family. And in that choice, the fates of the Iron Islands and the North were forever altered.